Okay, welcome everyone to this third running of our session on use of audio in teaching and learning. If I can find the text chat, I'll put the link to the presentations. It's the same page where you registered, and you'll see, hopefully you see in my screen, we have this presentation here that has a panel about welcome to this session, about us, the hosts, and then an individual panel for each of our speakers. And hopefully I've just correctly added a link to their presentations on each one, and their social media links are there as well. This is the page where you'll find the recording probably sometime next week after we've uploaded it and processed it a bit. So everything will in one place. We used to do an overview of Zoom, but I think most people were familiar with Zoom today. So if you do have any issues, open the text chat, open the participants panel, and post something perhaps directly to me in the text chat if you're having any technical issues. But other than that, we'll get started with Lillian, you doing the usual summary of what people want.
You're muted, that's it.
Sorry, I only have one screen today. But yeah, normally we do tell people when you register, you tell us what you'd like to learn when you join the session. So some of the key themes from people, obviously tips for podcasting with students, but also audio strategies, so not just podcasting, but anything else around teaching and learning. And then what are the advantages of podcasting, making an audio file public versus just using audio files with your students, how to make audio clips engaging, can't always assume it's engaging, a bit about audio feedback and inclusion, how to make it more accessible for people with hearing impairment, and then some practicalities around quality of audio recordings and how to make things quickly and easily, and finally about communities of podcasters as well. So yeah, without further ado, I think I'm going to hand over to Rosemary?
Yeah.
So I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker. So with us today is Dr. Andrew McLaren from the School of Social Sciences in Heriot-Watt University, from their Edinburgh campus. So Andrew's research focuses on social linguistics of teamwork, so how teams communicate, very relevant topic. But he's also very engaged in learning and teaching scholarship, and particular interest in assessment literacy, feedback, and digital pedagogy. And that's where his presentation is coming from today. He's done some fabulous work with his students using podcasting, and he's going to share that with us today. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. I'm just going to hopefully get this right, share the right screen and make it all work. So hopefully you can all see my screen.
Yep, all good.
Okay.
Great. So I'm ready to go when you're ready to fire the starting gun.
All yours, Andrew.
Thank you. So hello, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for the introduction, Rosemary. My talk today is entitled Investments and Dividends, a Trip Through Audio Podagogy. I think Rosemary's probably given a broad introduction, but just so that you have me in context, I'm a research and teaching member of faculty in the School of Social Sciences at Heriot-Watt. And as Rosemary said, I research and I teach teamwork, specifically the applied linguistics of teamwork in things like space crews, medical trauma teams, and I also look at neurodiversity in teams as well. So today I'm going to start with a short disclaimer. I'll then play you some audio that I've made for my teaching so that you get a feel for what I'm referring to as we go through the presentation. I'll then dive into what I see as the investments required when working with audio, and then I'll outline 4 dividends. And I'm going to finish with an excerpt from my most recent audio experiment, let's call it, a tutorial podcast. So first of all, a disclaimer, I'm an absolute audiophile. I'd sooner sit with a cup of tea and listen to Radio 4 or listen to a podcast than watch Netflix. So I think it's important to acknowledge that bias up front. But I see audio as valuable because it sits at a sweet spot of being accessible, but also worth the effort. And by accessible, I mean that really most phones are capable of recording high quality audio these days, and there's excellent free software for editing and producing. It's also accessible for students in terms of file sizes, data, bandwidth, device capabilities, things like this. And it's also accessible in terms of the learning curve. It takes proportionately far less learning to get up to speed on making good audio content compared to making good video content, for example. Why is it worth the effort? Well, my main comparison is between audio and video, but my experience with video is that the time required to produce a good video and what you can actually do with it once it's made represents far less bang for your buck compared with audio in the context of teaching. So as I said, I'm going to play you a short sample. This is a kind of podcast that I share with my students as a kind of preview or an advert for one of my classes, Team Performance Dynamics. And I send this before the semester starts. Hopefully this gives you a kind of feel for what we're discussing.
We'll then produce a written response to what caused the disaster for your assignment. In the second half of the class, we will explore other theories and ideas relating to effective teamwork, and you will produce a proposal for a set of team-building activities designed to improve the performance of a team of your choice. Each piece of coursework is worth 50% of your grade.
So let's get into the investment overheads. I started making audio materials for my teaching along a sort of flipped classroom idea back in 2018. And I did this in collaboration with a close colleague, Dr. Tom Farrington, for a research methods class. And I found it really creative and fun, but oh my goodness, did it take a while. First, we had to write the script, and I'd say a 20-minute podcast is about 2,500 words of content. And I think we safely spent about 10 hours writing it. It took us about 2 hours all in to record it. And it was another 10 hours or so of editing and mastering the recording. So roughly speaking, about an hour's work for every minute of content we produced. So the overheads of this kind of content are not small. What I would say though is that recording polished asynchronous content is probably the most labor intensive style of audio material. And I still find it very useful for learning the ropes on, producing high quality audio, how to edit, how to make things punchy, catchy. So I think if you can get your head around making decent asynchronous material, you'll be able to do anything else as well. So I reflected on the different types of audio content I've made over the few years I've been doing it. And what you see on screen is from when I started doing lecture capture, was the first ever kind of audio stuff that I did in 2016 and up to the present day. And what those yellow bars on the right-hand side represent is like how much time you need to spend on it against how many minutes of content you actually get out of it. And I think you can see over time, the different things I've done started off with very kind of asynchronous, quite highly involved things that, you needed script, music, other kinds of content, maybe interviews. And as time has gone on, I've gone more towards the sort of capturing live things and things that don't require so much work. So audiobook version of reading, guest lecture style podcast interviews, doing general feedback for coursework, and tutorial podcasts, as I'm going to come on to talk about. So I've gravitated towards less labor-intensive formats in terms of time spent. Maybe I've just become lazy, but you can see that there's a lot of different things that you can do in using audio in teaching, but they come with their own costs. And this is how I see the workload charting over time. So the time dedicated to scripting, recording, editing, they're all front-loaded. And they create this kind of spike of effort at the start. So you see on the screen there, you've got the yellow line, which is podcasts, this enormous spike of workload right at the start, and then it tails right off. With the more traditional methods are much more steady and stable in terms of workload over time. And knowing what this is like, that's why I find it quite amusing that when the pandemic came around and we were encouraged to just quickly record some asynchronous materials for our teaching. I think this is what makes something like working with audio quite daunting, because you sort of see that spike of effort required right in front of you at the start. We don't necessarily see that there's an enormous drop-off on the other side. And it's on the other side in that drop-off zone where all the dividends come. So I see the dividends of audio in teaching in 4 dimensions. It's durable, it's cumulative, it's flexible, and it's responsive. So I'm going to go into detail on each of those now. I find audio materials surprisingly durable. Videos age, particularly if you have a changing waistline or hairline like me, but your voice doesn't change. So once audio is made, you can use it again and again. Also, students listen to them again and again. If they need to refresh on something, they can go back to the audio and just hit play. So that original podcast I recorded in 2018 that I talked about, that I did with a colleague for a research methods class, that class has changed course leader 3 times since then, but it still uses the same podcast. And that's now been listened to over 5,000 times. They're also really useful to point students towards when they have questions. So you have a kind of time-saving value-add response to student questions when you can direct them towards some of your audio material. Audio materials are also cumulative. So not only do they endure, but they inevitably build on each other. So your bank of resources accumulates over time, rather than resources being replaced. So at the start, I envisaged replacing podcasts with new ones, but instead I find that I augment and supplement the stuff that I've already recorded. They're flexible and they're also modular. My students have told me that podcasts help them engage with materials around their other commitments. I think we're all aware of the kind of the changing profile of our students. I had one student last year who was also a bar manager, and she used to listen to her podcasts, the podcast for the class, on her drive home at 2 in the morning. And I've had a lot of feedback from dyslexic students who say this is the first time they've been able to keep up with the reading, for example. And it's modular. You can chop, cut, splice, and dice audio incredibly easily from different audio materials you've made. So things that I've made for one class, I can often repurpose them, at least in part, for other classes. And they can be responsive. So some of our students are finding it difficult to attend to class because of the cost of living crisis. And that's something that's really emerged in this academic year. So I did an experiment this year with a tutorial podcast. What I did was I got 6 volunteers from my class who, instead of attending a normal tutorial with 15, 20 odd students, they came to a podcast recording with me. And they had to be really well prepped because there was nowhere to hide. But the result was that those 6 volunteers got a lot out of the experience because they were so well prepared. And the other students who weren't managing to attend class were able to listen to a high quality podcast version of the tutorials. So I'm going to finish by playing a clip from one of those tutorial podcasts. In this episode, the students have had to listen to a preparation podcast that I've recorded. So they've listened to something up front before they came. And what we're doing in this podcast is we're using multi-level analysis to discuss different types of theory at the different levels around a case study of the disaster in Mount Everest in 1996. And they're discussing the intersection of complex systems and team psychological safety. Here we go. Yeah, that's great. So let's go on to complex systems and team psychological safety.
Well, I guess the fact that the weather was getting really bad, but no one felt comfortable to say anything about it and be like, oh, okay, I think maybe it's not a good idea to continue. They were just sticking to what their leaders were saying.
Mm-hmm. When the 2 groups joined up as well, they didn't know who to look to, they didn't know who to listen to and what was going to happen. And it wasn't really split up at all. And there wasn't really any psychological safety within the team anymore. It got to the point that everybody was left to kind of fend for themselves. If you want to turn back, you can.
Any other thoughts on that point of integration, complex systems and psychological safety?
So when Fisher was getting tired, then people in the team were concerned about his own health because he's the leader, but he did not listen to them. So there was a lack of communication. And they were even like scared to communicate that, how about you stop? How about you rest a bit? And that is like kind of related to the complexity of the team. Since he's the leader, he doesn't allow others to speak and like mention their concerns about his health and his ability to summit. So
yeah, so in a psychologically safe team, the person in a position of leadership models fallibility. That's what we know from Amy Edmondson. So in a situation where a leader is not doing that, so that leader is not fostering an environment or a climate that it promotes psychological safety, they become a single point of failure in a complex system that the system itself hasn't created the feedback loops to correct.
So my thanks to Anna, Hannah, and Doa by proxy for their contributions there in the podcast, and I will leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening.
Excellent timing. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to your students as well. So lots of points for thought there, folks. Do feel free to add some questions in the chat for Andrew, and we can pick them up after our other two presentations. Andrew, if you maybe want to, brilliant, you've stopped screen sharing. Teresa is going to introduce our next couple of speakers.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Seeing as we are thinking on this sort of series of Future Teacher webinars of reflection, the next two guests give me an opportunity to reflect on how and when I've met them. And Mark and I met at the University of Warwick many years ago. At the time, I was looking very seriously at how I could integrate digital audio in language teaching. And at the time, again, reflecting on how things have changed, I was particularly worried about how audio would be problematic with language learning when it's delivered digitally because of the buffering effect and the fact that it was therefore not terribly accessible to some people. How times have changed. Things have moved very, very quickly, thankfully. And perhaps our concerns are slightly different now. Mark very kindly offered me a sort of platform really to meet with other academics at Warwick who had an interest in digital audio. And I remember vividly starting this session with playing a clip, and I wanted something that would really grab attention. So I played a tiny digital audio clip. I had two very young children at the time of a baby crying. I don't know whether Mark still remembers it, but I certainly do. It certainly caught everybody's attention. Mark has continued to very much influence me in my professional development, although I've retired now. And he always has some really interesting and useful reflections on his work in the digital sphere. And Jane and I met through the Association for Learning Technology, where she and her energy totally captivated me with the work that she does. The work that she does, and yes, it was about Wimber, Mark, thank you, on copyright and how she manages to take a subject which is traditionally, and I know because I've worked with many practitioners, something that's very difficult to get their attention on, and her energy and her creativity in this sphere has really changed that picture. So I'm really looking forward to listening to both Mark and Jane, and I know you're going to find lots and lots of useful tips here. So I'm going to hand over to Mark. I can see the slides are ready.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I thought thanks. I thought I'd better get the slides there while I was here, to avoid multitasking. So, oh, and that's not, my slides aren't moving on. There we go, because I haven't got the right button. Accept multitasking. So, yeah, this is what we're presenting here is based on a paper that Jane and I and a couple of others co-authored, where we look, and it's drawing from the experience of podcasters from 4 different podcasts that are aimed at professional practice. So talking about professional practice in higher education. There are different themes for these, and that might come out in the chat afterwards. And I know there was a question about a community of practice for professional practice podcasters. And here's a general welcome to anyone. There's a core of 4 of us. There are a couple of other podcast people who've come in to sort of join us, and we co-present things at conferences, talk about what we do, and obviously waffle on each other's podcasts. So if anybody wants to contact me or Jane about joining this, at this moment, it's a very small community of practice, but it's hopefully expanding, then yes, please feel free. The reason why we put this paper together was because we've been asked at our separate institutions to do workshops drawing on best principles, and so some of this is drawing on a small part of the overall workshops that our colleagues have run. So there's a lot more to talk about, really, but I've only got 5 minutes, and Jane's only got 5 minutes. So one of the things that came out from talking to people is, why do a professional podcast about professional practice? And one of the things that came out was obviously to reach an audience for what it is that we do. And I think that's self-explanatory. But the thing that was a surprise was how much of a peripheral thing that was. We all found that all 8 people that we spoke to all had an audience in mind, but actual numbers wasn't a huge thing about what we were doing it for. One of the things that we found we really got out of doing this, and why it's a useful thing, I think, for others to do, was it's actually a really useful way to learn about one's own discipline by talking to other people. So we'd get guests on who are experts in different areas, and that meant that when we could learn from that whole process. Also, another thing was, and I think it's true for a lot of us, is that there's a kind of thwarted desire to perform. And that's definitely true for Jane and Chris. Not thwarted in their podcasts, I have to say, and the same for Mike and me, and for the other people we spoke to, was that it's a chance for us to explore a part of ourselves that isn't necessarily tapped into in our normal day-to-day jobs. And so we can put on funny voices, we do performance things, all this sort of thing. And so that sort of is a kind of outlet for that area of things that we wanted to talk on. So self-indulgent to some extent, but we found that also draws other people into listening to what it is that we're doing. And another one was, we like working with other people, and it's very difficult sometimes to create a space for doing that. But when you've actually committed to producing a podcast per month, that then drives us to this sort of shared space. So Andrew and Beatrice, who talked about their exquisite education podcast, they said that they always have a little space at the beginning of their day for doing this sort of stuff. So I think that also ended up being the key thing for doing it. We talk about some of the practicalities. One of the reasons why we were all drawn to it, I think, in the first place, was that it's actually quite cheap. A microphone, the not necessarily top end, but definitely the high quality end that you need it's only £45 to £60. You need a pop shield because of so that the air when you're speaking doesn't get picked up by the microphone. That's only £5, stand and so on. It's quite cheap. The technology is free. So if we're doing it at a distance, we use a website called Zencastr, which then records things locally and and it is just a kind of shared platform for doing things like Zoom, but more geared towards podcasting. We always we do post-production on the podcasts, which means that then it's more listenable too. We can do what we like during the podcast, gives us the freedom to do what we want, and then we can edit out the bits that don't work. So that's free. And then Anchor, which is how we distribute the podcasts, that's free as well, free to host. So all of those things actually make it really accessible for most people, for anyone really. There we go. Why have we found that it's powerful as a tool specifically for professional development? As I've just said, the accessibility and the affordability was what drew us to it in the first place. The audience that we have, most people in HE are time poor. We find that they can listen to podcasts while they're doing other things. It's that sort of runs in parallel. And I know this is what's come out of some of the themes that Teresa mentioned in what this session is about. And I think one of the reasons why it really works as well is that really as a genre, podcasts are essentially conversations. That is where they're placed. They're relaxed. They have to be fun. But the thing about about conversations is that conversations, you co-create content along the way. There are emergent discoveries that you uncover by talking about things, by digging into different things in more depth, by going off in tangents, by making links that aren't there normally. And all of this, I think, not only makes it listenable to, it also makes it more and more informative. So one of the issues that we have, and we still have, is drawing in the balance between getting the formality, a structure, there's content that has to be included, there's things we need to get across to people to make them worthwhile to listen to, but the informality is a sort of, you know, the kind of the spoonful of sugar that helps the pill go down, in as much as it's the entertaining thing that brings people to it. It's the entertaining thing that makes us want to do it. And I think one of the things about the structure and what we go into in more depth in the paper, which will be published later, it's been accepted, will be published later this year, is the different sorts of things that have to be brought into the mix to get this formality and informality balanced correctly. I'll just now hand over to Jane, because that's my bit. So Jane talks about Copyright Waffle, and this is her podcast specifically.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks very much. I think we're doing well on time in there as well. So yes, I've been running the Copyright Waffle podcast now for about four years. I'm going to ask Chris to put that in the chat because I can't quite remember when we started doing it. Lost track of time with the pandemic in the middle. But I run this podcast with Chris Morrison, who is the copyright and licensing specialist at the Bodleian Library at Oxford. We also have a website, and we have been doing a lot of work to make copyright engaging and empowering and fun, and not this kind of negative thing that gets in the way of your teaching, but actually something that allows you to do all sorts of things. We kind of came up with this idea of setting up a podcast. So Chris is saying our first podcast, September 2018. We really like talking to people. We like talking to each other, and when we present, we often find that we're kind of bouncing ideas off each other, and we felt that part of the way of making learning about copyright accessible and engaging could be to just experiment with different formats and to try a podcast. So the waffle is because of this tendency I have to waffle on quite a lot, which can be good and not so good when you're trying to actually record a podcast and make it, you know, within a particular period of time. But also it's like, it is, as Mark was saying at the start, a really fantastic opportunity for us to learn more about copyright, to talk to people and to have these more informal conversations with people about, like, why did you get into this subject? Why is it, you know, the area that you work in? What is it about copyright? Tell us the engaging stories about you know, how copyright impacts on people's lives. So we always say at our sort of little kind of, you know, welcome to Copyright Waffle, that it's an archive of chats by people whose lives have been touched by copyright. But in fact, from almost all creative people, their lives have been touched by issues related to copyright. So what we're trying to do now, we started off talking to people who were very much maybe like law academics, some of the kind of great and good in the copyright world. But what we're trying to do now is actually talk to much more creative people, to talk to people who work in music, who work as writers, as researchers, and to understand the role that copyright plays there, because, you know, it's a fascinating and interesting part of creativity. If I could have my next slide, please, Mark. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, reflections on some of so it's over 20 podcasts that we've done now. A couple of our podcasts we've had to divide into two when we've talked for longer than we might have expected to people. But one of the things I have learned from doing this is that having areas that you want to focus on and to talk about with somebody and not a script is really helpful. Chris and I got a lot of very, very valuable advice from a journalism lecturer, one of my fantastic colleagues, Richard Evans, who works at City University. He was on BBC Radio Wales for a long time, and I think also on 5 Live. But Richard was fantastic at kind of helping us think about how you interview people in a way where it doesn't just sound like I ask a question, they answer, and to feel a little bit more relaxed. The other thing is, as Mark was saying, like you can kind of fix an awful lot of things in the mix. So editing is really key to the audio quality. And yeah, we've kind of said basically, I even know the kind of little shape in the audio file that my ers make now, and I can sort of start to work out in Audacity how to cut them all the bits I can cut out to make it just sound that little bit better. I used to pretty much the moment record was hit, get pretty terrified and clam up, which is the opposite of me, because normally, as I say, love to waffle on, put me in front of an audience. I feel very relaxed. I don't mind talking, but it's something about that record button that was freaking me out. And sometimes I have to say I still do get a little bit nervous. So this was us doing a podcast with Cory Doctorow, a little bit of a kind of fangirl moment I was having, I suppose, but also somebody who his capacity to talk is incredible, and the number of ideas that he puts together, you know, just in a couple of minutes makes it very hard to keep up. So yeah, it was quite terrifying actually to sort of be interviewing him and try to listen to what he's saying and what am I going to say next as a response. And then the other thing is to say, and this is all Chris's fantastic work, I am not musical, as anyone who's ever heard me do karaoke could tell you, but everybody does love a jingle. So we've come up with like a theme tune, we've got little jingles that we play at various points in our podcast, and we're very envious about Mike and Mark for their little Rodecaster that's got all the little buttons so they can put in little bits of audio at specific points. But yeah, I mean, we've been really experimenting with this performance and creativity, and particularly Chris, who is a very talented musician as well as somebody who can write really good novelty jingles, and he's kind of using it as a way of actually recording some really great little songs for people based on some of the things they talked about in the podcast. So I think he shared a couple of links to some stuff we've put up on YouTube. So lots of great stuff, although yeah, we did hear from some people who said they hate our jingles. So not everyone loves jingles, but most people do. Finally, yeah, I mean, I do think it is, Mark, you said the word self-indulgent. Somebody who listened to our very first podcast sent us a fairly unpleasant message telling us it was completely self-indulgent, but actually what's wrong sometimes with, you know, talking about the stuff that you love and, you know, having a good time. This picture on the right, some of you probably recognize, that's a bit of a parody of a Beatles album. Chris and I managed to talk to the #1 Beatles historian in the world, Mark Lewison, about copyright. And that was just the most fantastic podcast we've ever done. And also started listening to lots more podcasts. So lots more on the slides, could waffle on forever. That's me, that's Mark. Check out our podcast. Let us know what you think.
Fabulous, both of you. Thank you so much. And I seriously recommend tuning into those podcasts. I personally never go to sleep without listening to a podcast of some sort. Just a routine for me, because like Andrew, I'm an addict when it comes to audio.
And I think you're introducing.
Great, yeah.
Our next speakers. Yeah.
So our next speakers, again, this is a sort of a reflective practice moment for me, because audio has been such a big feature in the last 20 years of my professional life. One of the things I pushed for many years ago was, you know, why do we not make audio easier for tutors to include in their VLEs. And I whittled away as you tend to do. And as Mark mentioned, I was looking then at Wimber, which was then acquired by Blackboard, and things change. And with those of you who regularly come to Future Teacher will be aware of that. We're very much sort of victims of the technological change cycles that go on all the time. As practitioners, we have to sort of find our way through. Well, I was really excited when Dublin City Uni looked at how audio could easily be included in Moodle. And that's how I started sort of getting involved really with looking at how development, particularly open source development, was moving the picture forward in terms of audio. And when we were doing this reflection podcast, I took to Twitter and asked, and Rob Delaney very, very kindly stepped forward. So Rob, maybe you'd like to share your slides. There we go. So Rob and Claire are going to talk to us now about the audio feedback developments that have happened at DCU. And I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you very much, Rob and Claire.
Thank you very much, Teresa, and all the gang for inviting us here today to speak about what's been going on in DCU in recent years around audio within Moodle and specifically audio feedback. I'm going to share a little bit about the background to the work that Teresa has alluded to, and then my colleague Claire is going to step in and share some reflections from staff and students around their experiences of using and engaging with audio through Moodle. So a little bit of background for you, first of all. Obviously, at DCU, we've been users of Moodle for almost 20 years now. We were one of the first universities in the world to adopt Moodle, and our philosophy has always really been, let's try and make as many of our staff and students as we can to use the VLE and use the VLE well, instead of trying to overcomplicate our technology systems and have too many tools for our teachers and our students to master. We do try and get our students and our staff to use our Moodle as well as they can. But despite that, of course, and I'm sure this is an experience many of you have as well, most interactions and most information on our VLEs are still very heavily text-based, even in this day and age. I think the pandemic obviously has maybe shifted the dial a little bit towards more audio-visual provision of content and so on, but we still find that obviously our information and our interactions on the VLE are very heavily based in text. But what we do know, and I know Andrew alluded to this in his presentation earlier, providing students with the opportunity to engage with multiple forms of media really supports universal design. It supports flexibility, supports students who maybe have specific learning needs such as dyslexia, etc., and in general can kind of reduce barriers to learning. We're big proponents of UDL at DCU. Similarly, we also know that multiple forms of media can support teacher presence, so that this idea of the teacher being a living part of an online course element as part of the community of inquiry model. So those were two big drivers for why we wanted to make audio and video much more easy to work with within Moodle. And in particular, we are also very interested in the area of assessment and feedback, and we really wanted to try and help our lecturers develop their assessment practices and provide feedback in such a way that it would be more meaningful and more engaging for students to engage with. So that was really the driver for us developing a plugin for Moodle back in 2016 with our good partners, Learning Technology Services. And there are obviously a host of audio video tools out there for people to record and create audio video and edit it and upload it, etc., etc. But we really, and as Teresa alluded to, we really wanted to create a very, very simple tool that staff could use to record audio and video directly within Moodle. I'm using the word we here very judiciously, but in particular, it was led by our colleague, Dr. Mark Glynn, who has now since left DCU, and our good partner, Gavin Henrik from Learning Technology Services, who many of you develops quite a lot of things for Moodle. So they really drove this development back in 2018. And the guiding idea behind it was essentially, although we were particularly interested in supporting audio feedback on assignments, we didn't want to just restrict the recording tool to only assignments. The general idea was that, well, anywhere where rich text could be in Moodle, so be that in a Moodle book, in a Moodle assignment, in a Moodle quiz, anywhere there was a text field, we wanted teachers to be able to see a little button on their toolbar where they could just hit record, and that recording could go directly into that text area within Moodle, and it would just be very, very easy to work with. We were very happy with that plugin, and Moodle HQ was also really impressed by the development of that plugin, and it therefore became incorporated into the core Moodle version 3.5 in 2018. So what does it look like? I'm showing you a screenshot here now of a rich text area in Moodle. Looks like any other kind of text field you might work with. There's a toolbar on the top where you can format your text, etc. And you can also see on the top there are buttons there for recording audio and recording video. So it's that easy. A teacher just goes, clicks the button that they want to start their recording. They're then brought up, a little modal window pops up, whether they're recording audio or video. In this screenshot, I'm showing you the recording button for how to record audio. Big red button, can't miss it. You click the button to start recording. And then immediately then a timer starts counting down. So part of the plugin is that you can restrict the length of the recordings by default on site-wide. Now we've restricted it to 2 minutes with 2 minutes, which is relatively short, but we find it is, and Claire will allude to this now in a moment, we find it is still useful for keeping people on point and keeping them targeted in their feedback. But the recording starts counting down within the time frame allotted. After the recording is finished, the teacher can either decide that they want to record again if they weren't very happy with that little audio clip, or if they are happy with the clip, they can click a button to attach the recording to the text area. And then after they do that, a little audio clip appears within the text area. And then when the teacher saves that piece of content within the text area, students can then come in and play it back and listen to it. It is so simple. It all works within the browser. No additional software is needed. No editing skills are needed. Anything like that. It is really, really simple and used directly within Moodle. Simple for teachers to create and record, and simple for students to click and listen back to as well. So what I might do now is just pass over to my colleague Claire to share some reflections from our staff and students on the use of this tool for audio feedback purposes.
Great stuff. Thanks, Rob. And I suppose I just want to add a short disclaimer at the start to say we're going to share a few snapshots really of reflections from lecturers who are using this plugin at DCU. It's not a full-scale research project. I think, we don't have exact numbers, for example, on the numbers of staff using this tool at DCU, but that's something we have in mind for the not too distant future. So the first one I just wanted to share with you really, this one is here from Siobhan McGovern, who is an Associate Dean of Teaching and Learning with the business school, DCUBS in DCU. And if I may just briefly read it out, she emphasizes that in her use of audio feedback, which she's been using for over 4 years, she says that the use of voice personalizes the feedback, even if the same or similar comments are given to many students. And she says that I found that where I used audio feedback, it opened a fruitful dialogue between me and my students in a way that written feedback did not. And I think that's a really powerful selling point for audio feedback that she's emphasizing there, because she's saying that, that once she got over the fact that she was presenting and she relaxed into kind of an informal mode of giving feedback, what that led to ultimately was the beginning of a conversation that students could engage with. instead of written communication, which to her mind felt more like a full stop. So that very much feeds into this whole idea of assessment for learning, where you're trying to encourage, when you're giving feedback, you're trying to support and encourage a conversation with your students around areas that they may have difficulties with or may need further information on. So I think that's a very interesting point that she's raising there. So Rob, if we move on to the next slide, please. Then we have another lecturer, Sarah Raftery from DCU School of Nursing, Psychotherapy and Community Health. And Sarah has been using audio feedback in both formative and summative ways for the past several years as well. And Sarah, who I've actually worked with on a number of studies around or papers around audio feedback, she's making the point here that audio feedback seems to help students to connect better with their lecturer, and therefore it motivates them to engage with their academic work. So she's taking up that similar theme, highlighting that for some reason, through receiving the feedback in audio mode, it seems to encourage the students to engage more with the task at hand. Now, she does point out that one potential challenge for educators is to ensure that their tone of voice is encouraging and supportive of the student, so that the student can engage comfortably with the feedback. And as a side note, I heard from another lecturer who says, whatever you do, don't give your audio feedback when you're cross or in a bit of a bad mood, because that will come through in your voice. So I think Sarah's making that point also. So if we could move to the next slide, please, then, Rob. Okay, now we have some short reflections from somebody who is an Irish language lecturer, Aideen Nimia-Hurty. And what Aideen is doing, Aideen discusses how she asks her students to submit a video presentation as part of a CA in a language learning module. And she's finding, perhaps not surprisingly, she's obviously using audio feedback in a language teaching context. She's emphasizing that the audio feedback tool is a useful way to respond to their work and to highlight some aspects of pronunciation or phonetics that they should work on. And she's emphasizing that it seems to be more engaging than written feedback for that type of assignment. So if we move quickly on to the next one then, Rob, we also then have in a similar field or area, Gorojo Doherty, who is saying that he also has been using audio feedback in conjunction with video submissions. And he's emphasizing a number of points here. He's saying that using it with his modules, he's found it to be a method of swifter communication with students and as a useful guide on pronunciation and proper spoken convention. I think it's useful to note Gerod's comments on the strengths and weaknesses of that plugin in particular. He's saying that in his case, it allows for giving quicker feedback on tasks. And it's powerful then for the students to hear the lecturer or the tutor give advice and guidance on aspects of the task at hand, particularly where spoken word and presentation is a key aspect of the tasks. He does highlight, however, that the fact that the audio only records in 2-minute segments, it does not permit an expansive feedback. And he has found that perhaps explanations of the student's work in a task, it can give rise to a feeling of an element of pressure to rush through the feedback in his case. But I would say as well, I've heard of others say that that 2-minute restriction can be both a benefit or a curse, depending on how you're using it. Maybe if we move on to the next one, because I'm just going to share a little bit then. We've talked so far about what some staff at DCU have been saying about their use of the audio feedback tool, but let's hear from a few students in this regard. And I think it's interesting to note that Paul is actually a TA with the School of Business at the moment, but he first encountered audio feedback as a student a number of years ago. And he's emphasizing that the strengths of the audio feedback tool are definitely around the personal connection from the lecturer. And that theme comes up time and time again. He's saying in his case, the lecturer was really able to put deeper emphasis on both the positive and negative elements of feedback. he also raises another point that I think is quite interesting to think about. He's saying it felt much better as a student knowing that the lecturer has put effort into the grading and feedback for the assessment that I spent time on. I think that's an interesting point, that the audio, perhaps more than the written, seemed to convey that idea. But Paul makes the point that he's able to re-listen and write down the points he's able to refer back to. But in this way, he's saying on the weaknesses side, he did have to replay a couple of those audio feedbacks, segments back again afterwards, and sometimes perhaps a written piece of feedback is easier to refer back to. So we'll just move on to the last slide then, please. And this is just, I just wanted to close off to share some comments from a more formal research study in 2019, where we worked with children's and fourth year children's and general nursing students around their perceptions of audio feedback. And I think it's fair to say that these reiterate many of the points that have been made already. They really put an emphasis on this one-to-one connection with the lecture, the fact that it helped put them at ease, and the fact that it seemed to support their ability to understand the feedback. When someone is talking to them, they can understand more clearly what they're saying. But if you look in the lower right-hand corner, I think it's also interesting, and there are a number of similar comments around this, that this is one from a dyslexic student who's saying, I'm dyslexic and I find it difficult to interpret results when I'm reading. Audio feedback helped with understanding what the lecturer was asking for. So all of those themes and more will be discussed in a forthcoming article from the Journal of Professional Nursing. So watch this space. I'll finish up for now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, both of you. It's lovely to have that recap of sort of where things have gone since that work that Mark started many years ago. Yeah, it's really good to know that within Future Teacher, within our Xerte object, we're capturing all of this, and we can share the successes and the tips that you have presented us with today. Thank you very much.
Yes, absolutely. And so I know we're kind of running short on discussion time, but some of the other questions that were brought up when people registered for the session included an interest in whether it made a difference to have the podcast public, or if it was something that you just shared with students. And then another topic I'd like to bring in my colleague Robin, who's on the webinar today, about the importance of audio quality as part of the accessibility guidelines, really. So yeah, can we start with Robin?
Absolutely. It's a very interesting topic that sort of landed on my lap, because I do a lot of quality assurance for our Panopto recordings here at York. And I want to understand like the correlation between possibly student retention and the quality of audio, because I'm aware that having poor quality audio, especially with audio distractions like buzzing on the audio itself, can actually be very off-putting. I've been speaking to our psychology department, who have asked a different kind of question, that even if the audio is of poor quality to begin with, why do students use it? And what kind of impact does that have on attention or engagement and things like that? So I'd be interested to hear what any other thoughts that people might have on the subject.
Well, I could go. Yeah, I mean, I was just typing into the text, but there's so many different plugins that are available for, the digital audio workstation things. I mean, they're a bit beyond me, but Chris and Mike, who are the sort of producers on for the podcasts we work on, are really good at just tidying them up. So there's no real reason to have something that's poor quality. They can fix so many different mistakes that I think there's no reason to have it. I think just the ability to make it more listenable too. And I would also say it's not just quality, it's making them more listenable too, in terms of cutting out the ums and the you knows and the various tangents people go on to if it's a longer podcast, but keeping it concise and a clear through line of arguments is also an important thing. And there's no reason also, particularly with auto transcription, that you don't have a transcript as well. And I'd suggest also for visually.
Sorry, I'm in a call. The signs on the door.
Audio impairment is to not just have a transcript of the conversation, but also we try and turn it into some that's like a book chapter or at least a blog post, so that you don't want to necessarily read through a conversation with all the waffle in a transcript, but to actually have it concisely written as an informative piece, as a text piece is also useful.
I think there's real value there, Mark, in even if you don't put out word for word a script before you start, at least having a clarity about where your touch points are, because that does make it a lot tighter for the narrative, and it means that you're a good way towards getting a transcript at the end of it. And I know I've tried doing conversations with people and doing the transcript at the end, and I end up thinking, oh, why did we take such a long time to actually get to that point? Because we could have made it easier. So I think sometimes having a sort of skeletal script before you start is a definite help.
And Andrew, do you want to come in here?
Yeah, I'll try and be quick. I think it's a really interesting question because, audio quality probably runs in about 10 different dimensions, 10 different, what you mean by audio quality, what someone interprets that to mean can be very different things. To sort of reflect on my experiences, I think, there's been mention there from Mark about like what you can do kind of after the recording. So the affordances that some of the technology gives you to tidy audio up, whether that be removing, little quirks of speech or ums and ahs. There's also the input side, so how good is your environment to record high quality audio? And I think the final thing I would say is what I've experienced is I got really obsessed with input quality at a certain point. I reformatted a closet in the spare room of our house and, blah, blah, blah. And what I found was that was creating an obstacle to me actually sitting down and recording stuff. I just still do that sometimes. But there's a lot of stuff I've done for my students in recent months. I just sat at my desk here in the study. The audio quality is not as good. But once you tune into audio quality, you listen to something on Radio 4, you'll hear people, top level presenters who are doing a show on Radio 4 who have so blatantly recorded the stuff they're saying in their kitchen. And your ear kind of accommodates it after a while. So I think it's it's probably a loose answer to your question, but I think it's worth sort of saying those things.
That's very insightful, actually. This, as you say, it can go off in so many dimensions. When you talk about quality, it's a whole host of different things. It's not just about, we're talking about duration, we're talking about the quality of the actual recording, but also how short, how dense, or how conversational the actual output is, to make it more understandable. So all sorts of different ways to make something more high quality, but also more accessible. And those two things, I think, tie in together.
They do. There's a couple of nice points in the chat from Kat and from Rob about, sometimes things can sound too professional. And equally from Rob's perspective, actually, if you're wearing cheap headphones or you're listening through your mobile phone headphone jack, you probably can't hear the differences. So that there's perhaps almost like a normal curve. Too bad, yeah, that's not very good at all. Too good, maybe there's issues there, but there's a bit in the middle. Goldilocks springs to mind there. Just right.
And I just have one more point that I know I had colleagues who were creating podcasts for the first time. They were doing the recording themselves and trying to add some conversation into the teaching and learning. But actually they scripted it, and they were introducing some high level new discipline concepts and words. And because they scripted it, it was the most awful thing in the world to listen to, because it was full of 5-syllable words. It made no sense to listen to. You could read it and understand it, but you could not listen to it and understand it. And so there's this strange idea that being flexible around a script is probably, one of the best things that you
Yeah.
could do. Okay. So without further ado, I am just going to stop recording here.